Picture this. It's December 1941. The temperature has plummeted to negative 50 degrees Celsius outside Moscow. German soldiers, equipped with the finest military-grade leather boots engineered in the factories of the Third Reich, are dropping like flies. Their feet are turning black. Frostbite is claiming more casualties than Soviet bullets. Meanwhile, across the frozen battlefield, Red Army soldiers are not just surviving, they're advancing. They're sleeping in snow trenches. They're marching 20 kilometers through blizzards. And the secret to their superhuman endurance? A pair of boots that the entire German high command had dismissed as ridiculous peasant footwear. Before we dive deep into this astonishing story of survival, ingenuity, and how the coldest winter of the century was won not by steel but by wool, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Are you somewhere warm? Somewhere cold? Because trust me, after hearing this story, you'll never look at winter the same way again. This isn't just a story about boots. This is a story about how the wisdom of one humble Siberian hunter, ridiculed and ignored for decades, became the difference between life and death for millions. It's about how the greatest military minds in Europe overlooked something so simple, so obvious, that it was hiding in plain sight in every Russian village. And it's about a moment in history when survival itself became a weapon, when the ability to simply stand upright in the killing cold gave one army an advantage more powerful than any tank division. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about military strategy, about innovation, and about where true genius actually comes from. Because sometimes the most revolutionary ideas don't come from laboratories or war rooms. Sometimes they come from a man with calloused hands, standing in the Siberian wilderness, trying not to freeze to death. Let me take you back to 1897, to a place so remote it barely existed on maps. The Sakha Republic, what they used to call Yakutia, in the deepest, most unforgiving reaches of Siberia. This is a land where winter doesn't just arrive, it conquers. Where temperatures don't merely drop below freezing, they plummet to levels that make the North Pole seem hospitable. Negative 60 degrees Celsius wasn't unusual. Negative 70 was harsh but survivable if you knew the land's secrets. And there was one man who knew those secrets better than anyone else. His name was Alexei Sokolov, though everyone in the scattered villages simply called him Old Alexei, or the Wolf Hunter. He was 63 years old in 1897. With a face carved by wind and cold into something resembling ancient oak bark. His hands were massive, scarred from decades of skinning animals and setting traps. But his eyes were sharp, observant, constantly calculating. Alexei had spent 45 years surviving in conditions that would kill a modern human in under 2 hours without proper protection. Alexei's father had been a hunter. His grandfather had been a hunter. The Sokolov line had survived in Siberia for generations by understanding one fundamental truth. In the cold, knowledge is more valuable than strength, and adaptation is more powerful than force. Alexei had learned from childhood that every material had properties, and that wool, specifically sheep's wool, that had been processed and compressed in a very particular way, held heat better than anything else nature could provide. Not fur, not leather, not even the thick hides of bears or wolves. Compressed wool felt, processed correctly, created millions of tiny air pockets that trapped body heat while simultaneously wicking away moisture. It was insulation and ventilation in one miraculous material. But here's the thing that everyone from the cities couldn't understand. The thing that made them mock and dismiss Alexei's methods. Felt boots looked absurd. They were thick, shapeless, bulky. They made you walk like you had tree stumps attached to your legs. Elegant European leather boots were sleek, form-fitting, dignified. Felt boots, Valenki as they were called, looked like something a simpleton would wear. And so, for decades, they remained exactly that. Peasant footwear. A joke. A symbol of rural backwardness. Alexei had tried over the years to explain the science to anyone who would listen. In the winter of 1898, a Russian army officer passed through the region on an inspection tour. Alexei approached him outside the local administrative building, a wooden structure that groaned in the wind. The officer was a young lieutenant, educated in St. Petersburg, wearing imported German boots that shone like black mirrors. "Sir," Alexei said, his voice gravelly from years of cold air, "those boots will kill you if you stay here more than a week." The lieutenant looked down at this weathered old man in his ridiculous felt boots and laughed. Actually laughed. "These are military-grade leather, old man. German engineering. They cost more than you make in a year." Alexei nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. And they'll cost you your feet in 3 days when the real cold comes." The lieutenant's smile disappeared. Are you threatening me? No, sir. Just telling you what the cold will do. Leather conducts heat away from your body. It sweats but doesn't breathe. In -50, moisture freezes inside the boot. Then it freezes your skin to the leather. Then your flesh dies. I've seen it happen to 20 men who didn't listen. The lieutenant's face reddened. Whether from cold or anger, it was hard to tell. The Russian Empire's military outfitters know more about boots than some Siberian peasant. We don't need primitive felt slippers to keep our soldiers safe. Alexei didn't argue further. He simply said, I hope you're right, sir. For your sake. The lieutenant left 2 days later. He made it as far as the next garrison before Siberia. Frostbite forced him to be sent back to Moscow. He lost 3 toes. Alexei heard about it months later and felt no satisfaction, only sadness. Another young man who wouldn't listen. Another victim of arrogance in the face of the cold's brutal honesty. But Alexei kept making his boots. He taught his sons. He taught anyone in the villages who wanted to survive. And in those isolated communities, Valenki weren't a joke. They were life itself. Fast forward to 1941. The world has been at war for 2 years. Nazi Germany has unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 4 million Axis troops are storming across the Soviet border. The Wehrmacht is unstoppable, cutting through Soviet defenses like a scythe through wheat. By October, German forces are within sight of Moscow's spires. Hitler is already planning his victory parade through Red Square. The Nazi high command is confident. They have superior tactics, superior equipment, superior logistics. They've conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries. The Blitzkrieg has never failed. And now, they're about to deliver the final blow to the Soviet Union. But there's one variable they haven't accounted for. One factor that their intelligence reports had mentioned, but that their generals had dismissed as irrelevant. The Russian winter. German military planners had looked at historical temperature data. They'd calculated that their troops could handle cold weather. German winters got cold too, didn't they? Their soldiers had perfectly good winter coats. The boots were the finest leather, designed by German engineers who'd equipped armies for generations. There was no reason to worry. Except there was one critical difference between German winters and Russian winters. One difference that would cost the Wehrmacht more casualties than any Soviet counteroffensive. In Germany, winter temperatures might drop to -10, maybe -15 Celsius in a bad year. In Russia, specifically in Moscow in December 1941, the temperature dropped to -42 degrees Celsius. And it stayed there. For weeks. This wasn't cold weather. This was a cold that transformed the battlefield itself. Machine guns froze solid. Tank engines wouldn't start. Diesel fuel turned to gel. Lubrication oil became solid. And German soldiers, standing in their magnificent leather boots, began to scream in pain as their feet froze inside what had essentially become ice chambers strapped to their legs. The frostbite epidemic among German forces in December 1941 was catastrophic. Entire battalions were rendered combat ineffective not because they were shot, but because their soldiers physically could not stand. Medical tents were overflowing with men whose feet had turned black, purple, gray, the colors of dying tissue. Field surgeons were performing dozens of amputations daily. Toes, feet, lower legs, and still the cold kept coming. Meanwhile, something impossible was happening on the Soviet side. Red Army soldiers were functioning. Not just surviving, functioning. They were conducting night patrols in -50-degree temperatures. They were sleeping in shallow snow trenches without tents. They were marching through blizzards that reduced visibility to 0. German commanders couldn't understand it. Intelligence reports described Soviet troops operating in conditions that should have been lethal. There were rumors, wild, impossible rumors, that the Soviets had developed some kind of chemical heating system, some revolutionary cold weather technology that Moscow was keeping secret. German military scientists began studying captured Soviet equipment, looking for the miracle device that was giving the Red Army its supernatural resistance to cold. And what did they find? Boots. Ugly, thick, primitive-looking felt boots. The German analysts were baffled. Felt? Like the material used for cheap hats and craft projects? These boots looked like something medieval peasants would wear. There was no advanced technology. No chemical heating elements, no electrical systems. Just compressed wool. The German reports that went up the chain of command noted this discovery with something between confusion and contempt. Soviet troops are equipped with felt boots of peasant design. This cannot account for their cold weather performance. But it did. It absolutely did. Here's what was actually happening. The reality that German military science couldn't accept. The Soviet leadership, in the desperate autumn of 1941, had made a decision that seemed insane to every modern military mind. They had ordered the mass production of Valenki, traditional felt boots, to replace standard military footwear for winter combat. This order came directly from a logistics meeting where a junior quartermaster officer named Dmitry Pavlovich Antonov had dared to speak up. Antonov was from Siberia, from a small village where his grandfather had known old Alexei Sokolov, where everyone wore Valenki in winter because anything else was suicide. At the meeting, while generals and commissars debated rationing of leather and rubber for military boots, Antonov raised his hand, his voice shaking, not from cold but from the audacity of what he was about to propose. He said, "Comrades, we're thinking about this wrong." The room fell silent. A senior general stared at him. "Excuse me, Lieutenant." Antonov swallowed hard. "The winter is coming. A real Russian winter. Our soldiers need Valenki, not leather boots." Several officers actually laughed. One colonel said, "Felt boots? Are you joking, Lieutenant? This is the Red Army, not a village harvest festival." But Antonov stood his ground. This was his moment, his chance to save lives with knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Siberian survival. "Sir, with respect, I grew up in Yakutia, in negative 50-degree cold. I've seen what happens to men in leather boots. I've seen what happens to men in felt boots. One group loses their feet, the other group survives. It's not a question of tradition or pride, it's physics." The room erupted in arguments. How could they equip the Red Army with peasant footwear? What would the soldiers think? What would the enemy think? But then another voice cut through the chaos. Let him speak. It was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who would become one of the greatest military commanders of the war. Zhukov had been listening carefully. He too knew the Russians. Winter. He too had seen frostbite casualties. "Lieutenant, explain the science," Zhukov said. And Antonov did. He explained how compressed wool felt created insulating air pockets, how it absorbed moisture without conducting cold, how it allowed feet to breathe while maintaining warmth, how Siberian hunters had survived for centuries using this exact technology, how his own grandfather had learned the technique from a legendary hunter named Alexei Sokolov, who had tried to tell the army about this 40 years earlier. When Antonov finished, the room was quiet. Zhukov looked around at the assembled officers. "Can we mass-produce these boots?" A factory director who had been silent until now spoke up. "Yes. We have felt-making facilities in the Urals. We evacuated the machinery from textile factories before the Germans arrived. We could retool to produce Valenki within weeks. The process is actually simpler than making leather boots." Zhukov made his decision in seconds. "Do it. I want 500,000 pairs by December. Tell the factories this is a priority equal to ammunition production." Some officers protested. This was insane. Felt boots? The Red Army would be a laughingstock. But Zhukov silenced them with a look that could freeze blood. "I don't care if it's traditional or modern or what the enemy thinks. I care if our soldiers can stand upright and fire their weapons when the temperature hits negative 40. Make the boots." And so, in October 1941, in factories across the Soviet interior, workers began producing Valenki on an industrial scale for the first time in history. It wasn't glamorous work. It was hot, exhausting labor, rolling and pressing wool fibers, compressing them into thick felt sheets, molding them into boot shapes, drying them in massive ovens. But the workers knew what was at stake. Every pair of boots they produced was a soldier's life. By late November, as the first brutal cold fronts swept toward Moscow, hundreds of thousands of pairs of Valenki were being shipped to the front lines. Soviet soldiers, initially skeptical about trading their sleek leather boots for these bulky felt cylinders, were ordered to make the switch. Many grumbled. These boots were embarrassing. They looked ridiculous. They made you walk like a drunk bear. But then the temperature dropped. And dropped. And dropped some more. And suddenly those ridiculous boots became the most precious item on the entire Eastern Front. Let me paint you a picture of what December 1941 actually looked like on the ground. German soldiers huddled in whatever shelter they could find, unable to conduct operations because simply standing outside for 30 minutes risked severe frostbite. Their beautiful leather boots had become death traps. Soldiers who had to stand guard duty were being rotated every 15 minutes because any longer and they'd collapse from cold injury. Many German troops were wrapping their feet in newspaper, rags, anything they could find, stuffing it inside their boots to create insulation. It barely helped. Meanwhile, Red Army soldiers in their Valenki were conducting full combat operations. They were digging defensive positions in frozen ground. They were launching counterattacks in howling blizzards. They were lying in sniper positions for hours in sub-zero temperatures. Soviet scouts were penetrating deep behind German lines, moving silently through the snow on feet that remained warm and functional. The difference wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming. It was the difference between an army that could fight and an army that could barely survive. There's a recorded account from a German officer, Captain Hans Müller, who was captured in late December 1941. During his interrogation, he was asked what he thought had caused the German offensive to stall. His answer, preserved in Soviet archives, is telling. We didn't lose to Soviet tactics or Soviet courage. We lost to the cold. And the Russians didn't lose to the cold because of their boots. Their felt boots. We thought they were primitive. We were wrong. The interrogator, perhaps sensing propaganda value, pressed further. Just boots? That's why the mighty Wehrmacht stopped. Müller's response was bitter. You don't understand. When half your men can't walk, when every step is agony, when your feet are rotting inside your boots, yes, boots become everything. We had better tanks, better tactics, better training, but we couldn't stand up. And your soldiers could. That's the entire war in one sentence. This account was classified for years because it was almost too simple, too unglamorous to be believable. How could the greatest military machine in modern history be stopped by footwear? But that's exactly what happened. The Battle of Moscow, the first major German defeat of World War II, was won by many factors. Soviet courage, Stalin's refusal to evacuate, Zhukov's brilliant counteroffensive, the mobilization of Siberian reserves. But underlying all of it, enabling all of it, was a simple reality. Soviet soldiers could operate in the cold, and German soldiers couldn't. And the primary reason was boots. Felt boots, Valenki. The ridiculous peasant trick that Alexei Sokolov had tried to explain to a dismissive lieutenant 43 years earlier. Now, here's where this story takes an even more fascinating turn. In 1942, as the war ground on, a Soviet journalist named Yevgeny Petrov was assigned to write propaganda stories about the Great Patriotic War. His editor wanted stories of heroism, of technological superiority, of Soviet genius. Petrov, being a thorough journalist, wanted to understand the real story behind the Valenki phenomenon. How had this traditional boot become a military weapon? He tracked down Lieutenant Antonov, now promoted to major for his crucial contribution to the war effort. Antonov told him about growing up in Siberia, about his grandfather's stories, about a legendary hunter named Alexei Sokolov. Petrov became obsessed. He wanted to find this hunter, to interview him, to tell his story. The problem was that Alexei Sokolov had died in 1923, at the age of 89, largely unknown outside his remote village. But Petrov was determined. He traveled to Yakutia, a dangerous journey during wartime, and found Alexei's grandson, a man named Mikhail Sokolov, who was 61 years old in 1942. When Petrov arrived at Mikhail's small wooden house on the edge of a village that still wasn't on most maps, he found an old man who looked remarkably like the descriptions of his grandfather. Same weathered face, same massive hands, same sharp eyes. Mikhail was wearing Valenki, of course. In Siberia in winter, what else would you wear? Petrov introduced himself and explained why he'd come. I want to tell your grandfather's story. The whole world should know that a Siberian hunter's invention is helping to win the war. Mikhail looked at this city journalist with something between amusement and sadness. My grandfather didn't invent Valenki. Felt making is ancient. But he understood them. He tried to teach people. No one wanted to listen. But now they're listening, Petrov said. Now the whole Red Army is wearing them. Mikhail nodded slowly. Yes. Now that thousands have died. Now that we're in the middle of the worst war in human history. Now people are willing to learn. My grandfather always said that wisdom is cheap. But people prefer to pay with their lives before they'll accept it for free. That quote, wisdom is cheap, but people prefer to pay with their lives before they'll accept it for free, struck Petrov like a physical blow. He wrote it down exactly as Mikhail said it. It would become one of the most repeated quotes of the war, though most people never knew its origin. Petrov spent 3 days with Mikhail, learning the history of Valenki, learning the specific techniques for making them properly, learning about Alexei's philosophy of survival. Alexei had believed that true strength wasn't about dominating nature, but about listening to it, understanding it, working with it. He'd believed that the coldest places on earth taught the warmest lessons about humanity. Because in the cold, arrogance dies fast. Only humility, adaptability, and wisdom survive. When Petrov finally left Yakutia and returned to Moscow, he wrote an article that his editor initially refused to publish. "This makes us sound primitive," the editor complained. "We need stories about Soviet industrial might, not peasant boots." But Petrov fought for his story. He argued that this was exactly the kind of narrative that showed Soviet strength, the ability to learn from traditional wisdom, to adapt, to overcome enemies through ingenuity rather than just brute force. Eventually, a version of the story was published in a military newspaper. It was heavily edited, with more emphasis on Soviet industrial production capacity and less on the humble Siberian hunter, but the core message remained. The boots that were saving soldiers' lives had roots in ancient survival wisdom. Within weeks, that story spread through the ranks. Soldiers began to feel different about their Valenki. They weren't just ugly military issue anymore. They were a connection to something deeper, something that represented Russia itself. The ability to endure, to adapt, to survive the unsurvivable. Meanwhile, at the highest levels of German command, a very different realization was taking place. By the winter of 1942-1943, German military leadership finally understood the magnitude of their cold weather equipment failure. Desperate orders went out to develop better winter boots. German engineers studied captured Valenki, trying to replicate them. But here's the problem. Felt making at scale requires specific wool, specific machinery, specific expertise. Germany didn't have the industrial capacity to produce felt boots in sufficient quantities, especially while also trying to manufacture tanks, planes, and ammunition. Some German units tried improvising, wrapping their leather boots in cloth, stuffing them with straw, anything to add insulation. It helped marginally, but nothing came close to the effectiveness of properly made Valenki. The German army, despite being one of the most advanced military forces in history, simply could not solve the felt boot problem. By 1943, the Eastern Front had become a nightmare of frozen, retreating German soldiers facing Soviet forces that could operate in conditions that remained lethal to the Wehrmacht. And every time German generals tried to understand how they'd lost their overwhelming advantage, the answer kept coming back to the same unglamorous, infuriating reality. Boots. The Soviets had better boots. The war continued for 2 more brutal years. Millions more would die. The outcome would be decided by tanks and artillery and aircraft and the courage of millions of soldiers. But historians who've studied the Eastern Front in detail keep coming back to that first winter, to December 1941, when the trajectory of the entire war shifted. When the supposedly invincible Wehrmacht stopped advancing and started dying in the snow. When the Red Army discovered that sometimes the most advanced technology is actually ancient wisdom, properly applied. After the war ended in 1945, there was a ceremony in Moscow. Various people who'd contributed to victory were being recognized. Major Dmitry Antonov, who'd championed the Valenki program, was among them. He was given a medal for his service to the war effort. During the ceremony, he was asked to say a few words. Antonov, now middle-aged and gray-haired from the stress of war, stood at the podium and said something that wasn't in the approved speech. "I accept this honor on behalf of my grandfather, who learned from Alexei Sokolov, and on behalf of Alexei himself, who tried to teach the Russian army about survival 40 years before anyone would. Listen, this medal represents something important. That wisdom doesn't always come from universities or laboratories. Sometimes it comes from an old man in Siberia who spent his life studying how not to freeze to death. We should have listened to him sooner. We should have listened to all the old hunters, all the village grandmothers, all the people who seem primitive to us educated city folk, because they know things we've forgotten, and sometimes those things save millions of lives." The speech was not well received by all the officials present. It was too humble, too critical, too focused on a peasant hunter instead of Soviet scientific achievement. But the soldiers who were there, the veterans who'd survived the winter of 1941 in their Valenki, understood exactly what Antonov meant. After the ceremony, several of them approached him. One old sergeant, missing 2 fingers from frostbite he'd gotten before the Valenki arrived, shook Antonov's remaining hand and said, "Thank you for remembering the hunter. Every time I put on those boots, I thought about the man who figured this out. I imagined him in his village, keeping his family alive, and I felt connected to something bigger than the war. Those boots weren't just equipment. They were proof that we understood survival in a way the Germans never would." The story of Alexei Sokolov and his ridiculous felt boots eventually faded from public memory, overtaken by narratives of tanks and battles and great generals. But, in certain circles, Among veterans, among historians who studied the Eastern Front in obsessive detail, among the people of Siberia who never forgot, the story remained. It remained as a reminder that innovation isn't always about inventing something new. Sometimes it's about paying attention to what already works. Sometimes it's about humility in the face of those who know more than we do. Sometimes it's about recognizing that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. Alexei Sokolov never